Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 752 Archival Outreach lecture. This week we will be talking about information seeking behavior. So I'll be looking at a couple of weekly topics this week. What behaviors do some researchers engage in when researching archival materials, and how can archives adapt to researcher behaviors? So I'll start by looking at some of the questions that are asked when researchers are when archives are considering the information seeking behavior of researchers. So the peer reading for this week on page 66 talks about the importance of understanding the information seeking behaviors that researchers engage in and how it's related to getting some insight into the assumptions and expectations of information seekers. So really trying to be aware of what kind of assumptions researchers make about archival materials and what kind of expectations they have when they are working with archival materials. Looking at a researcher's information-seeking behavior goes back to this concept of researcher services, which we have been talking about in this course. So this would be an attempt to focus on the use of archives and on the people that use archives. And it really corresponds with the overall mentality of researcher services, which is that archives exist to be used, and really anything that an archives can do in order to make the use of archives more common and relatedly more enjoyable and beneficial for researchers. That's something that researcher services is really connected to. And again, understanding the information seeking behavior of researchers, as we'll discuss in this lecture, can really go a long way towards helping an archives be focused on researchers and facilitating use. So next we'll focus on some different types of information seeking behavior that a researcher may exhibit while they are working to solve their information need. So as we discussed last week, when a researcher has some kind of purpose or motivation for finding information, they have an information need. And again, the idea is that archives are well situated to solve that information need. And the more archives are able to do that, the more they're able to make people aware of the value that archives have, and the more likely it is that people are going to be willing to support archives in various ways that will benefit archives in the access that archives have to the infrastructure that they need to succeed. So one type of behavior that a researcher may exhibit is mentioned on the Chasanoff article that we read for this week on page 140, where the author talks about how researchers can shift their focus and shift their behavior in the course of a single interaction. So a researcher may begin the interaction with one goal or one source of information that they're looking for. And as they interact with materials, as they learn more information, they may shift to seeking information that may be slightly different from what they originally thought they needed or that they expected to find. So this really situates researcher behavior as being in a lot of instances pretty fluid. It's not necessarily something that is going to follow a strict A to B to C dynamic. So A, I have an information need. B, I find what I'm looking for. C, my information need is resolved. There may be a whole bunch of intermediate steps within that that formula, and the overall path that a researcher takes may move back and forth, kind of like a cardiogram, which I have here. So knowing that a researcher may shift the focus of their information and the different activities that they use to find information as they are looking to solve their information need, it can be beneficial for archives to be able to get a good picture of what these shifts look like. So to really see how a researcher's expectations change, how a researcher's desired information changes, and that can allow archives to develop more of an understanding of why researchers behave the way that they do. So what causes their information need to shift during the course of an interaction? Is it because they're dissatisfied with the information that they're finding? Is it because they're dissatisfied with how they're being asked to find information or how they're being asked to compile information? Another value of mapping these shifts in behavior is that it can help archives identify contextual materials. So if a researcher is working with one collection or working with one part of a collection, and then for whatever reason, they move to a different collection or a different part of the same collection, then that may indicate that there are contextual relationships within a collection or among collections that archivists were not necessarily aware of. And that can be really valuable information for archivists because they can pass this information along to researchers that may be studying a similar topic. So a researcher study may indicate that a researcher worked with a particular set of information before a reference interview. And knowing what that information was and how that information was used can provide archives with information about related sources that are available to the researcher. And that might also be an important thing for archives to know when they're conducting outreach. So if you know that a researcher looked at a particular collection or another resource before they came to your repository, then you may consider how you can reach out to researchers before they even visit the archives to kind of point them into the archive's direction. But you may not know this information if you're not attempting to identify how researchers have approached solving their information need and how the focus or the structure of their information seeking behavior has changed over the course of their research. So this idea of researchers conducting in research that isn't linear and doesn't involve just one step and may in fact involve looking at several different resources both before and after they interact with an archives is called berry picking. And this is something that our Pew reading for this week touches on. So as a person's research proceeds, the search terms that they use change. As they acquire information, the questions that they're asking changes, and that leads them to different resources. It results in shifts in their behavior, and it results in them consulting resources that they maybe were not aware of or didn't plan on using before they were presented with new information or before the nature of their request changed. So there's a nice diagram of the Pew of this berry picking idea in the Pew chapter, and I think it's a pretty apt metaphor. Instead of finding all of your berries in one bush, you go from bush to bush to bush to find the best berries that are most relevant to your information-seeking need. So it may well be the case that berries outside of the archives determine the possible relevance of archival materials, and then berries inside the archive determine the actual relevance of archival materials. So a researcher may do some preliminary research outside of the archives to determine how applicable materials within archives may be to their information need. And then again, once they get into the archive, they may bounce around through several different collections or several different resources that the archive offers in order to really refine and satisfy their information needs. So this could include obviously a variety of collections, access tools like online collections or a catalog of collections. It could be subject guides that the archive has created. So there may be a whole lot of different berries even within the archive that the researcher has at their disposal to review. So just knowing that this type of information-seeking behavior goes on can allow archives to consider, or help archives consider, how they can position themselves as being a berry that researchers pick. What kind of outreach tools can they consider engaging in order to help point people towards archives and to collection materials that may be relevant to their research. If a person doesn't know about archives or doesn't think that the archive has anything that's applicable to their information need, then they're not going to use archives. So it's important that archives do position themselves in some way to be a bush that researchers eventually come to pick information. So a researcher may well begin their search on the outside, again by looking at a variety of sources, and some of the sources that we'll touch on today include social media, more informal resources like colleagues or peers, and then that may hopefully lead them into berry picking inside of the archive itself and interacting with the different resources and services that the archive has to provide. And again, we'll touch on some more of these things in this lecture. And gosh, doesn't this look like a nice living room? I would love to do research in a place like this. I wish I had a living room that was this nice, although I can see probably about 90% of these things wouldn't survive having a 2-year-old, for longer than a week. So, maybe someday. The Chesnoff article mentions another type of information-seeking behavior that researchers may engage in, and this is the personal collection of sources. And Chesnoff identifies this as being more of a contemporary practice among historians, and it involves scholars using portable digital cameras to snap images in archival reading rooms, or downloading online digitized sources, or even using scanning equipment at home to develop their own source of their own collections of sources. So knowing this, it's important that archives have this capability present within their archives. So they may have a policy that encourages or allows researchers to snap images in archival reading rooms. I would imagine that's pretty common today, but I don't know that it's necessarily universal. But if you know that this is something that historians are interested in doing, and you know that there are a lot of historians coming to your repository, then it makes a lot of sense to let them know that they can do this, and set policies about what this is going to look like. If you know that historians are interested in being able to download digitized online sources, then it would be really beneficial for your repository to have that feature with your online collections. Now, some archives are kind of skeptical or a little freaked out by this because of copyright. So this may be something that archives are a little more reluctant to allow. But again, if you know that it's something that your researchers want, it's something that you really should think about adding that capability to your online collections. And again, the overall goal here is to have as much overlap as possible between the services that your archive offers and the types of information-seeking behavior that your researchers typically engage in or want to engage in. And by doing so, you will become a berry that historians are more likely to access in the future. If people are able to go to the archive and do research in a way that they're comfortable with, that they are familiar with, that they want to research, then that's going to result in them having a good experience. And that may well lead to them either coming back as repeat researchers or perhaps recommending to other people that they go and conduct research at your archive. Another information-seeking behavior that our readings for this week touched on was the use of social media. One of our readings for this week really focused on the use of Wikipedia as a tool for especially students. So the article stated that more than 80% of college students used Wikipedia or social media for academic purposes. But they also talked about how social media may undergo little scrutiny, and that can really impact the quality of information that researchers get from social media. And the article also touched on about how it may be difficult in evaluating the information in social media. Despite these limitations, the article mentioned that students use social media because it is very accessible and it's very easy for them to access and to use, and it's a really easy berry for them to pick from. And it's also something that's more likely than not they are going to be fairly familiar with as well. So that may lead them to consider social media to be a a barrier that they choose to pick from just because of their uh, familiarity with it, and that can really go a long way towards making a particular source of information appealing. If you are familiar with something, you're going to feel comfortable using it, and comfort can really make it more likely that you are going to go back to something over and over again if you aren't intimidated by using it, or if you feel like it's something that you have a lot of experience navigating through and working with it. In particular, Wikipedia is often used as a starting point to get this background or quick information about uh, about a particular topic or a particular subject. And so it tends to be something that is used in the early stages of the research process, or an early berry picking spot for academic researchers. And so knowing this, archivists might consider ways which they can increase an awareness of their materials on Wikipedia. It could be by contributing to an article about a particular topic that the archive has collections related to, and having a citation, perhaps a link to the archives or to the online find aid for the article. That would be a great way to drive a lot of traffic to your archives. So again, this idea of knowing that researchers are going to be engaged in this berry picking activity, that Wikipedia may well be one of the early berries that they consult, and having something within Wikipedia that encourages them to consult archives as their research process evolves. So this article mostly focuses on Wikipedia, but it's important to consider how other social media platforms might be used by researchers in order to gather information. And again, this is typically going to occur before a researcher engages in any kind of archival research. So, looking at something like Instagram, a researcher may use Instagram to find more information about a particular topic. A researcher may use something like Twitter or Facebook to connect with colleagues or peers or fellow students who are also interested in the same topic or have done research in the same topic, and get information from them via those social media platforms. So knowing that researchers may be using Facebook or Twitter or Instagram for these purposes, it really behooves archives to have some kind of presence in these platforms that, again, will make researchers aware of how the archives can contribute to their research and point them in the direction of archives. So it could be through some kind of hashtagging, which may turn up if researchers search for a particular term through Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. And that may lead the researcher to perhaps the archive's social media account or straight to the archive's website or the archive's online collections. So that'd be another example of how knowing that this berry picking activity goes on and that social media may well be a part of berry picking can allow archives to adjust their outreach in a way that can harness social media for the purposes of increasing the use of archives. The pool and the PU readings for this week discussed informal and formal sources. And as archivists or as researchers are engaging in research, as they're attempting to solve their research need, they may consult both of these types of resources. So for example, formal sources would be something like citations. So looking at footnotes or citation chaining, that's something that Poole on page 388 identifies as being foundational for historians' search for sources. And Pew mentions it as well. This would be related to working with an archivist as a source of information. That would be a formal source. Relatedly, Chasanoff identifies consulting with electronic resources to orient your research. That would be working with a formal source, working with digital representations. So these would all be considered formal sources that a researcher may engage with as they are as they're berry picking and working through their research process. And those are all pretty well known as sources that researchers may be aware of and work with. But it's also interesting to think about some of the informal types of sources, or the informal sources that a researcher may work with as well. So this may include working with colleagues and peers to discover information. So this is something that Poole calls the invisible college. So you're looking for information about X and you know that one of your colleagues or one of your peers has a good background knowledge in that topic. So you go and ask them for their opinion about where you might go to find additional information, or maybe for the information itself. What researchers are really looking for is authenticated and evaluated information in context. And again, if you are a researcher that is asking a colleague or asking a peer for their opinion, you're doing so because you feel like they can help you, that their voice has, or that their opinion has some authenticating property to it because of your estimation of their expertise and their, intelligence and character. And also a hope that they can, that they're able to evaluate the quality of the information that they're giving you, that they're not just going to send you to, Jim Bob's blog for information about what you're looking for, but they're able to provide some estimate of the value of different sources that that might be available to you. So how can archives position themselves to benefit from researchers using formal sources? Well, by having people use archives for research articles, that's going to help create this this groundswell of footnotes or citations that a researcher may come across when doing their own research, and that may be something that shepherds them towards using an archive. So I'm doing a research paper about X. I'm looking at an article related to that topic, and I see that some of the materials that the author of this article used in their research was from this archive. And I'm seeing that in footnotes, I'm seeing that in the bibliography. So that provides the authentication and the evaluation of that information that I'm looking for. So I'm aware that this resource exists. I'm aware that this resource has some kind of value, and therefore I'm more likely to consider using that source myself. If archives are aware that a particular scholar in a particular field maybe has influence over other people in their field of study, or perhaps they know that the person is an instructor that has a lot of influence over their students, then that may be a person that the archives identifies for outreach, because the archives knows that they may be an informal source that researchers may talk to and consult with before they think about or maybe even know to go to an archive. So again, it's all about knowing what kind of sources your researchers may seek out before they reach archives, and trying to position your archives in a way that makes it more likely that eventually your archives is going to be a berry or a bush that researchers are going to pick from. And it may well be a case where researchers start out looking at informal sources, so talking to colleagues and peers, getting tips on where they might find more information, and then those colleagues and peers may direct archives or may direct researchers to looking at more formal sources like archives and citations. And then that may lead to researchers using those formal sources and then perhaps continuing to work with formal sources, or perhaps going back to informal sources just to get more context and more information about the topic that they're looking for. So again, this idea of kind of a process that can shift and take several forms as the information that a researcher has evolves and as the questions that they're asking change too. And so this is something that we talked about when we discussed reference interviews, right? As the archivist sits down and talks with the researcher, that may lead to the researcher developing different questions and refining their information need in a way that they didn't anticipate. So again, just this idea of the research process not being linear, but one that can kind of zig and can kind of zag, and the role that archives can have in that happening. One thing that is going to have a lot of say in whether or not a researcher actually uses a resource, whether it be an archive or another source of information, is what Pew refers to as the principle of least effort. And so this is the principle, as Pew notes on page 65, that people will use the most accessible information regardless of whether it is the best. And Pew states that this is true even among serious scholars, that they're really likely to choose easily available information, even when that information may be objectively of low quality, and that researchers tend to be satisfied with whatever can be found easily, in preference to pursuing higher quality sources whose use would require a greater expenditure of effort. So this really goes back to why Wikipedia might be so appealing to students. It's just really easy to use. You can just do a search, you can find the Wikipedia page for whatever you're looking for. The Wikipedia page itself is broken down into sections with information that might not necessarily be terribly in depth. And, I know there are still some questions about the accuracy of Wikipedia. I think those questions are less strident than maybe they were when Wikipedia started. But it's just really easy to use. And then there are some citations at the bottom, which gives it this veneer of authenticity and this veneer of evaluation. So Wikipedia is super easy to use, and that's why people use it. It's understandable to them, they're comfortable doing it, they've probably done it before. It just doesn't require a lot of effort to get information from Wikipedia. Archives can be different. Archives can be something that people are not as familiar with, they may not understand as much, and the resources that archives offer may not be ones that are developed in a way that facilitates easy use by researchers. And as P notes, if that's the case, then honestly, archivists can't really blame researchers for not using archives. We can't really offer resources to researchers that are difficult for them to understand, or that don't allow them to research in a way that they find easy and useful and intuitive, and then say, oh, well, you're a bad person for not using archives. It's actually the archive's fault, at least to a certain extent, that they aren't aware of how researchers research, and that they aren't providing that that structure for researchers to interact with and thrive in. So knowing what a researcher's information seeking behavior is, and knowing that the principle of least effort can be a big part of shaping how researchers act, can really emphasize the need for archives to develop and offer services that are easy for people to use, that don't cause people to just throw up their hands in frustration when they go to try and use an online find aid or use an online collection to find what they're looking for. So this is a good principle to keep in mind as you are thinking about what services you offer and why they're structured the way that they are. Obviously, archives can't be everything to all people, and there are a lot of constraints to the different services that archives can offer, but obviously the usability of resources is something that archives should really consider, because if something isn't usable, the principle of least effort suggests that it's not going to be used, and all the resources that you've thrown at your online collections or your online find aid are just going to be wasted, because people are going to say, okay, this is difficult, I'm going to go use Wikipedia, and screw the archive. So that's obviously not a good situation. So again, generally speaking, the more effort to use services there is, the lower the likelihood of using those services. This is going to be less true as one of our readings for this week noted, if the research that the researcher is doing is really significant, or if they have a high level of motivation, then even if things are difficult to use, they still may power through to get them done, no matter how excruciating it is, simply because there's some exterior motivation that is compelling them to do so. But that's certainly not going to be the case all the time, or even most times. Most people are just going to come in with pretty non-pressing uh, information needs, and if they hit a brick wall, they're just going to back up and try and find another way to get their information. So this isn't a universal rule, but I would argue that it is a pretty common reality for researchers. So we'll wrap things up by looking at some of the connections between researcher studies and information-seeking behavior. Because there are a lot of ways that, that they are tied together, and that they overlap and in some ways contribute to each other. So as I have noted here in my diagram, a researcher study can allow archives to know if the programs and the resources that they're offering meet the needs of their researchers. So if a researcher study consists of an examination of the different types of information-seeking behaviors that researchers engage in, and then with that information makes a determination of how well the current resources that the archive offers meets those types of information-seeking behaviors, then that will let them know that yes, we have programs that that meet the needs of our researchers, that overlap or match, at least to a reasonable degree, the types of information-seeking behaviors that our researchers are engaging in. And because of that, we feel comfortable that we have services that meet the information-seeking behaviors of the people that use our repository. So a researcher study can really affirm or allow an archive to understand how well their services do meet the expectations of people that are attempting to use archives, as far as how they're going to interact with the archives and how they're going to interact with the resources that the archive has to offer. Some other connections include if a researcher or if an archives knows the different characteristics of their researchers, which they can learn by doing a researcher study, such as their occupation or experience, or the anticipated use of their research, then that may lead in archives to have more of an understanding of the different types of information-seeking behaviors that researchers are going to engage in. So if you know that you have a lot of historians who use your archives, then that can allow you to evaluate the services that you offer through the lens of the different types of information-seeking behaviors that historians typically have. And if you discover, well, what we're offering doesn't really provide the features or structure that historians want, then we should probably go in and change our online collections, or change how our online finding aids are written, and attempt to adjust to the types of information seeking behaviors that we're likely to see. If you are unaware of the different types of information seeking behavior that your researchers engage in, then you may not know exactly what your researchers want. And so there's a lot of value in having a researcher study that attempts to find out what your researchers' expectations are, what their assumptions are of the services that archives are going to offer. And by having that knowledge, you can have more of an awareness of, again, how the services that your archive offers should be structured. So here is a diagram of some of the different information that a researcher study may collect that does incorporate some of the principles of information seeking behavior that we've talked about. So you may attempt to map the berry picking and the other information seeking behaviors that a researcher exhibits outside of the archives. So you may attempt to have a better idea of the different types of resources that a researcher has utilized outside of the archive. You may attempt to learn how those different resources were utilized. So what were they used for? You might also attempt to learn why a researcher chose to access particular resources. And then you might also attempt to establish the quality of the information that a researcher located using the resources that they utilize. So did they end up finding information that they thought was particularly useful, or did they find information that they had some questions about or didn't really meet their information need? And it's also helpful to know what expectations researchers had that weren't met by resources outside of the archives that they used. So I went and looked at Wikipedia. I looked at Wikipedia through through my phone or my computer. I chose Wikipedia because it's easy for me to access, it's easy for me to use and understand. I think the quality of the information that I found was okay. However, I had some expectations for finding more in-depth information that weren't met. I had some expectations for authenticity and trustworthiness that weren't met. And so this has resulted in me continuing to search for information in a different venue. Another good thing about knowing the unmet expectations of researchers is it can provide archives with a lot of info about why they are valued. So I'm dissatisfied with Wikipedia, and I'm going to go attempt to use the archives because I feel like the archives is trustworthy. I feel like the archives is a good authenticator of information. I feel like the archives can offer the in-depth information that I can't get off of Wikipedia. I'm going to use archives because the collections are accessible and they're centrally located, and I don't have to, browse all over the internet to try and find what I'm looking for. And this can really provide the archives with information that they can use to market themselves. So, according to the researcher study that we've done, 9 out of 10 researchers that come to use our repository do so because they feel that our repository has information that is more in-depth than what they can find outside of archives, or you can get a lot of information supporting the trustworthiness of archives. And obviously these are things that can be valuable to share for advocacy purposes. So looking at information seeking behavior within archives, again, you can look at the resources within the archive that the researcher chose to use. So things like online collections, things like finding aids, things like a reference interview or an exhibit that the archive did. And then again, you can ask, how are these resources being utilized? Why did a researcher choose to look at a particular collection, or why did they choose to contact the archives directly instead of just using the online collections? And you can also get some information about the quality of the resources that your archive had to offer. So were you satisfied with your reference interview? Were you satisfied with the quality of our online collections? And then again, you can start to look at unmet expectations. So maybe the online collections were difficult to use, and that caused the researcher to contact the reference staff directly. Maybe the online collections didn't support the information seeking behavior or preference of researchers. So getting this information can really discover some incongruity between researcher information seeking behavior and the services archives provide, which, as we've discussed before, can be very valuable information. And then next, archives can attempt to gain information about this information seeking behavior researchers after they consult with or work with the archives. So after they left the archives, what additional resources that they used? Why did they work with those additional resources? How are those resources utilized? What kind of information did researchers get from these outside resources? What use did they make of the information that they found? So this is something that is probably going to be done more sparingly because it may take time to track people down and try and get an understanding of their information seeking behaviors after they worked with archives. So you might want to do this with select researchers, or maybe like a random sample of researchers, just to get this additional information about sources that researchers use after consulting with an archival repository. And this last one, uses of information, can be particularly important for archives to gather because, as I alluded to before, the sources of, or the uses of information can cause researchers to exhibit certain behaviors, and so that might be of interest to archives. So if you find out that a researcher was using the information for, an informal report, then you can understand, okay, well, that's why they only looked at 1 or 2 collections and they didn't use our online finding aids very thoroughly, or they didn't consult these other collections that might have been relevant. It's not because the collections are bad or because our services didn't necessarily meet their needs. It's just the researcher didn't have sufficient motivation to really dig in and do this additional research. If the use that a researcher is going to make of information is going to be very formal, then that can be useful information as well, because then you can say, all right, well, we know that this person was really willing to put in a lot of effort, but we see that they didn't consult with these other sources that might have been helpful to them. So is it because we just didn't do a good job making them aware of these additional resources? Or, why were the reasons that this person didn't discover maybe as much information as would have been useful to them? So really in both situations, both really formal and heavy uses of archival materials and pretty informal uses of archival materials, you can kind of go backwards and say, well, why did the researcher do this? Why did they exhibit these behaviors? And again, is that due just because of their preference and their process, or is it because of some flaws in the services that we provided to the researcher? So to wrap things up by putting things in kind of an overview, to be truly researcher services focused, and archives must be easy to access and use, so the principle will be suffered. And archives must understand where its patrons are searching for information before they contact the archives. So this idea of berry picking, so that they can market themselves more effectively and have a better understanding of the type of information that researchers are looking for. And again, this is so much easier to do if you know who your researchers are, how they typically use archival materials, and which resources they value and why. And so again, this really goes back to the researcher services model of gathering information about researchers and using that information in order to develop an archives that really facilitates use of its materials, and I would argue is in a much better position to advocate for resources that will allow the archives to thrive and succeed into the future. Okay, so that's it for our discussion about information seeking behavior. So I hope that looking at some of these different types of information seeking behavior have been helpful. Looking at the connection between information seeking behavior in researcher studies and knowing your researcher's needs, and also thinking about how archives can adapt to the different types of information seeking behavior that researchers engage in. So we talked about one aspect of advocacy being the ability to be opportunistic and to be creative and imaginative. And that really goes back to this idea of being flexible and thinking of ways to interject your archives into the places where people are looking for information before they contact an archives, and being proactive and not just waiting for them to stumble across something that leads them into the archives, but rather really engaging in strategies that make it more likely that such a connection is going to happen. And by doing so, you will be in better position to have more people using your archives. And as we've talked about before, that can be a really strong tool for advocacy in the future. So I hope that our discussions over the last couple of weeks have really helped add more layers to this idea of researcher services and some of the benefits that having a researcher services mindset in your repository can provide for your archives. So thank you for listening. As always, contact me if you have any questions, and stay safe out there.